All right. How we doing? There, that's better. Hey, as I mentioned, if you are new or coming back, my name is James Brown. And if you're here for the first time or if this is kind of new again to you, I'm so grateful that you're here. In fact, I would say to you that you showed up on an awesome Sunday because we are kicking off, as you just saw, a brand new teaching series called Home Team Advantage. And I believe that the topics that we're going to talk about throughout the next few weeks of this series will not only transform the experience that you have had of your family, but I think it has the potential to transform your whole family experience going forward as well. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with this phrase, home team advantage, it's a sports term. Sorry, some of you. It's a sports term that describes the benefit that arises from the cheers and positive affirmation that the hometown fans can give to a team during a home game. Whether it's around an arena or a court or a field, this sort of support is a major benefit, especially when things in the game are getting tough or the game is on the line or the score is really tight. And interestingly, although it is a sports term, that's not the only place where you can see the advantage of the home team. I would say that it's true in our families as well. God has uniquely designed family relationships to set the stage for success in every other life situation. In other words, one of the themes of this series is this, that winning at family leads to winning at life. And you know this, when things are going well at home, it impacts every other aspect of your existence, which is why we at Real Life want for all of us, all the families, not just in our church, but in this community as well. We want all the families to be firing on all cylinders. We want to help moms, and we want to help dads and grandparents and aunts and uncles and significant adults in kids' life, all of us. We want to help all to discover how to give your family or the family that you're part of or the family that matters most to you, how to give them that home team advantage. We want to, as a church, help them win as a family so that we can then win at life. Now, the challenge in taking on that type of objective, of trying to sort of resource and support families, is that every family experience is so incredibly different. Everybody's family is different in some way or another. In fact, I would love to do this. Think about if we did this, if I had Mike or Carl bring up a mic up here, and I would just bring you up one by one to sort of describe your family experience or situation. Some of you are like sweating in your armpits right now. Is he going to do that? Would he actually do that? I would love to do that, just so we're clear. I love train wrecks and hot messes inside dumpster fires. I would love to hear about that sort of thing. It would be a good chance, quite honestly, to put the fun back in dysfunctional. Why not? That sort of a thing. But we're not going to do that. We don't have enough time. But that's not even the hardest part of trying to help families. It's the fact that they're so different. That's a difficult challenge in doing something like this, but it's not even the harder part. See, I think things even get more confusing and more complex or more complicated than just having different kinds of families. I think it's harder to try to actually lock down or pinpoint a snapshot of God's idea or His picture for a perfect family. It's hard enough trying to nail down one type of family and how they all are the same, but God's not even really that clear when it comes to what His perfect family should look like. If you don't believe me, go to the beginning of the Bible and start reading. We did this last series. We started working our way through the Bible. And I would challenge you to try to find some picture, a biblical example of an ideal family, of a fully functioning family. I've read the Bible many times. And truth be told, I don't know that there is a really good family picture of a family that's in the Bible. And honestly, if any family should have gotten everything exactly right, it should have been the family that we look at every single Christmas season. The Holy Family, Mary and Joe and Jesus. Like if anybody should have been able to get it right, it should have been those three. But we find out in the Gospel of Luke, for example, that one time Mary and Joe left Jesus in Jerusalem by himself when he was 12. They forgot him. They forgot Jesus. They forgot the Messiah. They forgot the Son of God. Joe, have you seen Jesus? No, I thought he was with you. Oh no, I told you to get him. And the fight begins, right? Yeah, the little "we lost Jesus" situation kind of knocked them out of the running for first century Parents of the Year that year. They should have gotten it right. They should have been able to get it right. In the same way, our very first parents, Adam and Eve, they didn't do much better. We looked at this in the last series. Following the forbidden fruit incident, the first recorded homicide in history was when Adam and Eve's son, Cain, killed his brother Abel. And then families haven't been able since then to figure out how to get it right. It's just been going downhill from there. The Old Testament part of the Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures, they're full of families that give us really good lessons from really bad examples. And I think that's part of their purpose, but it also forces us to ask the question, with no really good biblical models or examples of family for us to sort of model our own families after, here's the question. What is our ideal family supposed to look like? What is God's picture of the perfect family? In other words, to sort of take on the theme of this series, how do we know what target we're aiming at? How do we know when it comes to family, how do we know when someone has crossed home plate and we get to put a score on the scoreboard? How do we know? How do we know if we're doing it God's way? Well, the good news is that although there's not a lot of good examples of families in the Bible is full of good examples for families. For example, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1 and 2 says this, "Children, obey your parents because you belong to the Lord, for this is the right thing to do. Honor your father and your mother. This is the first commandment with a promise." This is my favorite verse in the whole Bible, especially with a 13-year-old daughter. I say this to her every day. It's not working. But that's a good example for families. Another one is this, Colossians chapter 3, verse 18. "Wives, submit to your husbands, as it is fitting for those who belong to the Lord." This is also my wife's favorite verse. No, I'm kidding. Colossians 3:19. "Husbands, love your wives and never treat them harshly." 1 Peter 3:7 says this, "In the same way, you husbands must give honor to your wives. Treat your wife with understanding as you live together." Colossians 3:21. "Fathers, do not aggravate your children or they will become discouraged." That's my daughter's favorite verse. Now, I'm just listing a few. These are just a few of the many verses that talk about family. That they're not biblical examples of actual families, but there's advice and wisdom for families right there. And at Real Life Church, these verses and other verses, family-focused verses like these, are so important to us because we value God's ideal idea for the family. We value God's ideal idea for the family. Now, I want you to let that statement, leave it up there just for a second. Let that statement sink into your soul just for a second, because there's implications to this. We value God's ideal idea for the family. Now, if you haven't started having something churn a little bit in your spirit or in your soul just yet, if nothing's happening in you, you're not reading this statement right. If it hasn't started happening yet, if you're thinking about this statement correctly, you should begin to feel some tension around it. You should begin to feel some tension about it. And that tension is something that we're going to look at for the rest of this sermon. This tension that you should be feeling is the context for everything we're going to talk about for the rest of this whole time. Because according to the Bible, in every family situation, there's important dynamics at play that cause this tension. We have, first, the ideal. We have the ideal. We have God's desire, God's design for the family, God's dream for the family. That's His ideal. We have the ideal, and then we have the real. The real. And this is sort of the current state of our family. This is where we are today, where our family exists, the dynamics that are present. And then in the in-between, there's this tension. Because we fall short of that ideal. The real and the ideal are separate, and in between there's tension because none of us are able to quite achieve it. We're not able to get there. Now that's a tension, but there's an even bigger tension that we have to deal with, which is this: how in the world can we hold on to a statement like that we value God's ideal idea for family, when no one in the history of the world has ever accomplished it? Like, how do we hold on to that when it's not actually achievable by anyone, even Jesus' own family, as we looked at? Now, hopefully I've set up enough conflict here that I can help resolve. Maybe. We'll see how I do. So before you sort of check out, like, this is a terrible message, James Brown, you should get better at doing this. Or before you run out of the room and say, I'm out of here, I don't even like where this is going, you need to know that this dynamic that I'm bringing up, the real and the ideal and the tension that exists in between, Jesus set up these kind of scenarios all the time. He did this kind of thing all the time. In fact, Jesus was constantly pointing people to and teaching toward an ideal that people would never, ever actually be able to achieve. Now, think about some of the stuff that he taught. For example, the Old Testament part of the Bible said, don't murder. This is one of the big 10. It said, don't murder. But Jesus comes on the scene and he says, if you hate somebody, you are committing murder in your heart. How you doing with that one? Anybody crushing it? Anybody doing it great? No, nobody? Okay, good. Another big 10, do not commit adultery. And Jesus comes on the scene and he says, if you lust, you are committing adultery in your heart. Anybody killing this one? No, don't raise your hand. I'm just kidding. Don't. That's what he said, right? He also said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. And what he meant by that is if you make a promise, you keep that promise every single time. Another way that he sets this up is he says, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you on social media. I'm just kidding. If someone hits you, turn the other cheek. He says, don't worry, be happy. He didn't say the last part. He said, don't worry. Anybody got that one, nailing that one? Every single time? Some of you worry about the fact that you worry. I mean, it's like this inception cycle. It's terrible. Don't judge, he says. He says, forgive people whenever they ask for it. Do to others whatever you would like them to do to you. And maybe this is the granddaddy of them all. Jesus says this. If you want to talk about an ideal, here's what he says. He says, you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. I mean, talk about an ideal. You think you have daddy issues on earth, these divine daddy issues. I mean, that's a standard. How are you going to reach that? You're to be perfect, Jesus says, like God is perfect. What is going on? Well, this is the kind of thing that Jesus set up constantly, this real versus the ideal. And just so you know, I pulled all of these examples just out of 3 chapters in one of the biographies of Jesus called the Gospel of Matthew from the Sermon on the Mount. I pulled all those examples out of 3 chapters. Anybody doing great with all these ideals, getting all of these ideal ideas exactly right every single time? Yeah, of course. None of us are. None of us are, because that's not even the point. But this is the kind of thing that Jesus did all the time. He was continually teaching about and pointing people to God's ideal idea in some area of life. And we're talking about it in the context of family, but the truth is, if you are honestly attempting to follow Jesus, you're going to bump into this on a regular basis, this dynamic. When you look at Jesus' ideals from time to time, if you're going to try to really take them for what he said they are, you're going to begin to feel some tension about the fact that you're not there. You're going to get a little bit uncomfortable about your real life and how it's being lived. This tension you're going to feel because of your current condition. The real versus the ideal causing tension. It's there. So the question then becomes, when we don't reach it, what does Jesus do about it? When we're not able to achieve this perfection, this ideal that he puts in front of us, how does he react when we're not able to get there? How does he see us? What does he do when he sees the fact that our marriage doesn't match up to the ideal that God has for it, or the way that we raise our kids isn't exactly in line with how God would want us to do that, or our family finances don't sort of match up? What does Jesus do when we fall short? What does he do? Well, the answer is nothing. He does nothing. And that's what the deal is. Jesus pointed people to and taught toward an ideal, but yet at the very exact same time, he refused to condemn the people who fell short of it. He does nothing. God's not mad at you when you don't match up to his ideal. He's not frustrated with you. He's not going to take you out or to smite you when you're not able to sort of get that thing that he's putting in front of you. That's not how this works. That's not who God is. That's not the way Jesus was doing his thing. And you can see this balancing act play out in almost every interaction that Jesus has in the gospel stories. Actually, I think one of the most profound illustrations of this dynamic shows up in how Jesus understood family relationships, specifically marriage relationships, especially when they hit a fail point. And so I want to show you what that is today. So if you have a Bible or a Bible app, I want to invite you to join me in Matthew chapter 19, because what we're going to see in this passage is that Jesus is actually completely comfortable with the tension that exists between the real and the ideal. And I think that those of us who are trying to follow Jesus, we have to figure out how to do the same thing. We have to figure out how to, in the same way that Jesus did, learn to live in this tension as well. And so Matthew 19, verse 3, we'll start there. Here's how it begins. Some Pharisees came and tried to trap him, Jesus, with this question. So what's happening is Jesus traveling all over the place. He's got crowds that are following him, peppering him with questions. These guys were coming up wanting to do that, but their motives are impure. They're not coming to Jesus to ask a question because they want to learn. What they're trying to do is set up a scenario where they could catch him with something he said and then try to discredit him. So here's their question. It's sort of like a gotcha question, like Mark was doing to me a little bit earlier in the announcements. I'm not bitter, I'm better. Anyway, so they came up with this question. Here was the question. Should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for just any reason? Now, we don't have enough time to dig into divorce in the days of Jesus, but let's just say, in summary, this is sort of how it played out. Men were allowed to pretty much divorce their wives in the days of Jesus for almost any circumstance whatsoever. She burnt the toast. She's out. That was the deal. If you were a woman, on the other hand, you were stuck with what you had. you were stuck with that person no matter what. And so they're setting up this scenario. What do you think about this law, Jesus? And so Jesus says in verse 4, this is amazing. He says, haven't you read the scriptures? Okay, now, by the way, these men that he's talking to had most likely memorized the entire Old Testament part of our Bible, their Hebrew scriptures. They knew it by heart. It was in their head and in their heart. They could recite to you chapter and verse for the whole Old Testament. And so Jesus says to them, haven't you read the scriptures? I mean, he's throwing some serious shade here at these guys. Or as my daughter would say, slay, whatever that means. I think that's relevant. He's going at, this is like the supreme insult that you could give to these guys. But the next words that he says after this are the most important part of the statement, especially as it relates to our discussion. He said, haven't you read the scriptures they record that from the what? That from the beginning, God made them male and female. Now, what Jesus is beginning to do is he's beginning to formulate a case. He's beginning to make his case for God's ideal idea when it comes to marriage. He's laying the foundation. And so he goes back to the very beginning of the Bible. We looked at this in the last series. Genesis chapter 1, he makes the quote. He made them male and female. He's building his case. Verse 5, he says, "This explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one." He's building his case. He goes from Genesis 1 to Genesis 2. Page 1 of the Bible, page 2 of the Bible. He makes another quote. He's building this case for the ideal idea that God has for two people when they become married. And so he says in verse 6, "Since they are no longer two but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together." He said this deal is for life. That's God's dream. That's God's idea. It's his desire. It's his design from the very beginning. Now these guys that are questioning Jesus, they don't like his answer. And so they say, "Well, then why did Moses say in the law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away?" They don't like where he's going with this. And so Jesus replies in verse 8. This is amazing. You've got to see. This is so amazing. Jesus replied, "Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts." He's saying to them, real life happens, and we need to deal with it. There is a realness to what I'm asking people to do. And we got to deal with the real life when it comes to us. But it was not what God had originally intended. Do you see the elements? Do you see how Jesus is building the case for the ideal idea of marriage, but at the exact same time allowing for real life when it happens to us? You see, Jesus is saying, you know what, you want to know about family, you want to know about marriage? Well, let me take you back to the very beginning. Let me take you back to when things were perfect. Let me take you back to when things were the way God wanted them to be. Let me take you back to God's ideal idea. But Jesus is also saying, I also understand that sometimes things don't work out. I understand that people get divorced. I understand that it will happen. Sometimes it's inevitable, and we need a safe way to facilitate it. And so I understand the reality of life. But at the exact same time, I'm not going to lose sight of this fact that in the beginning, divorce wasn't the plan. In the beginning, God created things in such a way that two people become one, and you can't unone what God has made one. But at the same time, I know that sometimes relationships don't work and divorce happens. But that's not how it was designed to be. You see, this is both and. Jesus is navigating this. There's the ideal and the real, and Jesus is saying, listen, I'm comfortable bringing both of those things for you to hold in tension. I'm comfortable with it. I'm comfortable with holding on to the ideal and recognizing the real. I'm comfortable with it, Jesus says. And I want you to be comfortable with it as well. Now, I bring this idea to you, not just from a family perspective, but for a following Jesus perspective, because understanding this is so important. In fact, I think it's one of the reasons people find faith so frustrating, and why some people think God is mad at them all the time, because they're not measuring up. And Jesus says to us, I want you to be able to hold both in tension. And this is so important for us as we try to figure this out, because for many of us, including myself, and you'll probably recognize this dynamic in yourself, our tendency, when we experience this kind of tension, our tendency is to lower the bar. That's what we do instinctively. When we have this tension between the way things are supposed to be and the way things really are, we adjust the ideal, or we change the rules, or we modify the meaning of certain terms, or we reset expectations, or we redefine reality. We redefine family. We lower the bar in order to feel better about where we are. That's what we most commonly do. All of us, me included, lower the bar to feel better about where we are. It's much harder and much less common for us to do instead what Jesus was trying to model for us, which is to embrace a standard that many of us have or will eventually fall short of. You see, the essence of this tension is two paths, two questions that we have to navigate. The first question is this: am I willing to embrace an ideal that may never be a reality in my current family? That's one option. Or will I choose to ignore the ideal in order to feel better about where I actually am, or where my family actually is? And the truth is, including me, for so many of us, we have settled for less than God's ideal idea. In lots of areas, but specifically in the area of family. And if you've settled for less, if you've reduced the ideal idea that God had for your life, I want to say what you might need to do, number one, is raise the bar. That maybe you're new to faith, or maybe you don't know exactly what His dream is for you, for your life, for your family. You may need to dig into God's Word and figure out what that looks like. You may need a clearer picture of God's ideal idea for the family to raise the bar. And as I was thinking about this idea of raising the bar, it reminded me of a story about when I was in high school. When I was in high school, I participated, my fall sports, I tried to do different ones. My first freshman year fall sport was a little sport invented by Satan called cross country. I don't know if you've heard of it. The devil made it. It was the worst sport ever invented. But my family motto was, Browns don't quit. If you start a thing, you finish a thing. So, as is the way, you sort of put on your little stringy shirt and your underwear and run out in the blizzard. And it's just like, who invented this terrible sport? And as you imagine from my description, I wasn't very good at it. I was sort of mediocre, adequate at it. I would finish in the middle almost every time. But my coach, about halfway through the season, pulled me aside and he said, you can get better at this. And I'm like, I don't want to get better. I don't even want to do this. But he's like, no, you can get better. Here's how you can get better. And he said, what I see you doing every time you get to the end, near the finish line, he says, you get lazy, you sort of slow down, and you let your inertia take you sort of through the finish line. He said, if you want to improve your times, what you need to do is you need to actually imagine that there's a finish line at the end of the finish line. So beyond 10 steps or 10 feet or whatever, that's actually the finish line out there. And so what you'll do is you'll actually run at full speed through the actual finish line to your imaginary finish line, right? And it worked. It actually did work. And I think that's exactly what Jesus is trying to do for us with these high ideals. That He puts the finish line for family, the finish line for faith, way beyond where the actual finish line is, so that we end up running full sprint through the finish line, what we think the end is. And we begin to find out that we have more in us. That there's more potential in us that we ever knew. That our family can be better than we ever imagined when we're striving for the further finish line. When we're raising the bar beyond what we thought we could be capable of. So I want to encourage you, if you've settled when it's come to family, sort of excused current reality, maybe it's time to raise the bar and see what's truly in there, in your family, and what God might be up to. Second thing is this, to renounce your comfort. Renounce your comfort. And what I mean by that is simply this, that you become comfortable with living in the tension, that you're willing to live in the tension. Now, I know this is true of almost everybody. People hate tension. I know of people that have changed jobs because of the tension they had with the coworker. They would rather change their job than deal with that tension. I've known people that have moved because they've had tension with their neighbor. They would rather move to another house entirely than deal with that tension. People hate tension. I love tension. I didn't get that gene where you hate tension. That sort of got left out. In fact, I sometimes like to create it. It's a little weird, but that's sort of how I'm made up. But most people don't like this tension. But what I want to say to you, that maybe it's time to begin to recognize that it's there. You're not where you need to be. Here's where you are. Here's where God wants you. There's tension there. Maybe it's time to lean into it. Maybe it's time to start living in it. Because God may be wanting to do something in you that can only be done in the midst of that tension. And so whatever your family looks like, if you're doing the family thing right, there's going to be that tension. You got to recognize that. There's the real and the ideal. But in the midst of this, here's where I want to end. I want you to hear this crystal clear. If you've sort of missed the other parts, this is the most important part to grasp. Because if you're trying to do this, if you're living in the tension, you're trying to do family God's way, here's what I know. Here's what I know. For Jesus, as the standard gets higher, His grace goes deeper. As the standard that you're trying to get gets higher, His forgiveness becomes richer. Because whatever this looks like for you, whatever family has been in your past and in your present, for all of us, if you're going to go after this thing that God's calling you to do, there's going to be grace along the way. And for all of us, there's going to be forgiveness that He's offering us, which means that right now in this moment, there's the possibility of a brand new start if it hasn't been what it could have been. So what I want to say to you as I close is don't give up. Don't give up on God's ideal idea for the family. In fact, I would encourage you to honor it, talk about it, value it, strive for it in your own life, in your own family. Raise the bar, renounce your comfort, and then most importantly, invite God into that tension. Invite Him into that tension. Because the good news is that He wants to partner with us in making His dream for family more of a reality in our lives. And in order to get there, we've got to have God as a part of the equation. We need God in our families. We need God as we pray, as we prioritize, as we practice what it means to be a family. We need God right in the midst of it. And when He is present, His presence in that tension is actually the very thing that will give you and your family the home team advantage. Let's pray. God, we thank You so much that You have uniquely designed the family to set the stage for success in every other area of our existence. God, we're so grateful that even though so many of our families are not where they should be or could be, that there is hope and possibility and potential that they can become more of what You've designed them to be. And so, God, we want to do that. We want to focus on that. We want to invite You into that tension that we experience in our life between Your ideal idea for the family and our real life reality that we live in right now. God, come into that space and give grace where it's needed, to give forgiveness where it's asked, and to give hope for the future. God, we thank You for the family. We're excited to see where the rest of the series goes. We're excited for Jesus, who was able to navigate and hold those two things together in tension so well. Help us to be more and more like Him. And it's through His name we pray. And all God's people said, amen.